The GBC claimed that Srila Prabhupada wanted us to journey down Mr. Magu's path. Mr. Magu? The multiple guru path, the path that the GBC took us on. And the Rtvik Ras supporters say that the GBC were wrong and that Srila Prabhupada actually wanted us to traverse the path of the ongoing Rtvik representative of the Acharya system. I decided it's best to visualize this. So in my mind, I drew the two paths. Wow. Wow. Well, I did that? Really? Huh. Well, I should try that sometime when I'm not on the presentation to see if I can do it in real life. I mean, that's really amazing. So, my left, your right, is the path of the Rtvik representative system, and on my right, your left, is the path of the multiple guru path. So yeah, where was I? Oh, so it does help to actually visualize these things. So here are the two paths. The GBC's understanding at the time, back in May of 1977, was that the multi-guru path was the path that Srila Prabhupada wanted us to take. So they veered off the path that Srila Prabhupada had been taking us on, and they turned toward this multi-guru path, taking us along with them. But they were just about to take their very first step when the GBC realized something. They realized that they had just become totally lost even before they took their very first step on this path. The path was totally dark. And so they weren't at all sure how to proceed. The GBC met, and they couldn't even agree on how to actually take their very first step. First, should they lead with their right foot, or should they lead with their left foot, or should they come in, should they wear their sandals, should they go barefoot? Maybe there's snakes, maybe they should wear stormtrooper boots. They just weren't sure. Should they enter along the right side, should they enter along the left side, or should they just go right down the middle? The GB discussed so many things. Okay, not exactly those things, but you get the idea. They discussed how to proceed on this path for months, and they couldn't come to an agreement on how to take even the very first step. Why? Because this path was just totally dark. There wasn't even a torchlight of knowledge on this path. They couldn't see where the path was leading. They didn't know where they were going. It was like walking into a dark, vast, uncharted void, like a big black hole. By the time the GBC met in February of 1978 in Mayapur, which was 3.5 months after Srila Prabhupada departed, they still couldn't figure out exactly what they were really supposed to do. They simply, do they simply replace Srila Prabhupada as the current guru? Meaning, out with the old and in with the new? Were they to remove Srila Prabhupada's murtis and photos from the Vyasasans and the altars and put their own photos and have their own murtis made of themselves? And should they claim Srila Prabhupada's Vyasasan as their own? When Srila Prabhupada was present, we held only one Guru Puja for Srila Prabhupada because he was the current Acharya. On a daily basis, we didn't hold Guru Puja for Srila Bhaktisiddhanta or any of the other past Acharyas. So some of them argued that there should still only be one Guru Puja, but now it should be for the current Gurus, which would now be 11 new current Gurus. They argued that the temple should no longer hold Guru Puja for Srila Prabhupada. Some argued that the current new Gurus should now be worshipped and that we should cease worshipping Srila Prabhupada on a daily basis. While others objected, knowing that wouldn't go over very well with all the other Prabhupada disciples, and the majority of ISKCON members at that time were Srila Prabhupada's own direct disciples. So another argument was made that there should now be two Guru Pujas. One for the current Guru that will be performed by the new his new disciples and one for Srila Prabhupada, performed by Prabhupada's disciples. But if there are to be two Guru Pujas, then whose Guru Puja should be first? Or should they be held at the same time? And now that there were 11 new acharyas, whereas before there was only one acharya, so where do these gurus fit in with the GBC? Prabhupada was the one acharya who was above the GBC when he was present, but what about the new acharyas? Out of all of the GBC members, Srila Prabhupada had only selected 11 to supposedly become the next gurus. And everyone understood that a guru has to be on the Mahabhagavat Paramahamsa stage. So some argued that this shows that Srila Prabhupada had recognized those 11 men as being far superior, spiritually more advanced than all the other GBC members. And, in fact, they assumed those 11 had reached the Mahabhagavat stage of spiritual advancement. So should the gurus now be still taking guidance from the GBC? Or should the more advanced Mahabhagavat gurus be giving guidance to the other non-guru GBC? I mean, all of these questions, there are just so many questions and so many details to be worked out. None of these new gurus really knew what they were supposed to really be doing or how all of this was to work. As soon as the GBC had turned off of the path that Srila Prabhupada had been taking them on and entered this path of multiple gurus, they couldn't see anything. They found the path to be devoid of any light. The path before them was totally dark. There was no map to guide them. Why was it so totally dark? Well, it seems that the GBC at that time really didn't even stop to question that. Not back in March of 1978. But for the 11 appointed new Rtvik Acharyas, it was like the adventure of their lifetime. According to the GBC, these men were about to inherit ISKCON in the way of becoming the next Acharyas in our disciplic line. They were too preoccupied in their own thoughts about how to, of becoming gurus and big acharyas to really be bothered thinking about anything else. They were too far eager to enter this path of the dark side that they didn't even stop to think why the path was so damningly dark in the first place. And really, why was it so dark? The reason why it was so dark was very simple. Srila Prabhupada hadn't shed any light of his transcendental knowledge or guidance on this path of multiple gurus within the ISKCON mission. None. Nor did Scripture. ISKCON is Srila Prabhupada's ashram, and when he was present, he was the one and only guru. Srila Prabhupada had established a GBC, and his written instructions was that after he departs, that GBC was to become the ultimate authority for his ISKCON mission. He had left absolute zero guidance, no instruction about how multiple masters were to fit into that system of management. As the one and only master, when he was present, he had full authority over and above the GBC. But what about these new 11 masters? Where do they belong? They're supposed to be Mahabhagavats. Shouldn't they be above the other GBC members who aren't Mahabhagavats? For the GBC, Srila Prabhupada had prescribed them the duty to oversee the spiritual standards for the society and care for the spiritual welfare of all the members in their zone. Since the first gurus were also GBC men who were already performing these duties anyway, they continued to perform them. However, eventually, they came to do so only for those who they had performed the initiation ceremonies for, who they now considered those were their disciples. And gradually, they ceased performing these functions for all the other members in their zones. And eventually, those men who were GBC, but not gurus, saw that the gurus were now performing these functions, and so they also stopped performing these functions and duties, assuming that only the new gurus were supposed to do this. Thus, the whole structure of the GBC, as Srila Prabhupada had set it up, eventually became totally broken and disrupted. Later, after the GBC ordained non-GBC gurus, the non-GBC guru they were performing these duties, but again, only for their own disciples. All of this totally disrupted and completely changed the system of management Srila Prabhupada had spent 7 years setting up. On this multi-guru path, His Divine Grace had shed absolutely no light whatsoever at all on how this path was to be navigated and how this was all to work. The real fact is there were no instructions regarding this path at all, as if we weren't even supposed to be on such a path, as if no such path actually was to exist in ISKCON at all. He had left no map, no guiding light, no torch light of knowledge that would enlighten their way. None. This is why this path was so damningly dark. The GBC, with the 11 new gurus at the forefront, met at the meetings, at the GBC meetings in Mayapur, and discussed, and after days and days of wrangling, they couldn't come to an agreement on even how to take the first step, where to take that step, what to do or how to implement what would become such major changes in the way ISKCON was to be managed. At those meetings, Tamal Krishna mentioned that Srila Prabhupada had told that after he departs, if the GBC has some philosophical issue that they need help on, Srila Prabhupada told them that they could go to Srila Sridhar Maharaj, Srila Prabhupada's godbrother, for such philosophical guidance. Well, the GBC agreed they most certainly needed someone to help them, to give them some guidance, to enlighten them so they could just even begin to go down this totally dark path. And Srila Sridhar Maharaj was a senior Vaishnava to them. He was Srila Prabhupada's godbrother. And if Srila Prabhupada had authorized them to seek his guidance on philosophical issues, then it seemed a reasonable thing. I mean, for whatever reason, it appeared that Srila Prabhupada just must have overlooked this minor little detail, because he had left them with no enlightening guidance at all on how to begin to enter this totally dark path. It was, after all, the path of the dark side. The GBC and the 11 new gurus had so many questions as to what to do, and somehow His Divine Grace had left without giving them any answers at all. What seems odd in looking back on this is that no one questioned if this was the path that Srila Prabhupada really wanted them to take, then why hadn't His Divine Grace given them full and complete guidance and instructions on how to go forward? He gave nothing at all, no guidance whatsoever. The path before them was pitch black dark. If Srila Prabhupada had wanted that there be no changes in the system of management for ISKCON, which is what he instructed in his last and final will, then why didn't he give guidance on how so many guru master authorities were to fit in to that system? Not only was there no guidance, but why didn't the GBC find it, suspect and question if this really was the right path they were to be on? At the end of February of 1978, the GBC finally came to an agreement on at least one thing regarding this issue, and that was that they agreed they were all completely and totally lost and totally in the dark on this most important issue that now faced our movement, which would become the most important issue for the future of ISKCON. And so they agreed on one thing, and that was to seek Srila Sridhar's guidance on this most important issue. The GBC sent a handful of men to meet with Srila Sridhar Maharaj. Among them were Tamal Krishna and Jayapataka Maharajas. They informed Srila Sridhar Maharaj that Srila Prabhupada had selected 11 men as his successors and that these 11 would have become the next acharyas in the disciplic line. You know, this path, this multi-guru path that was now before them, it was totally dark, and Prabhupada had not left them any torchlight of knowledge or a map to guide them. They didn't exactly explain it that way to Sridhar, but they were coming to him for his torchlight of knowledge, and because now they needed his guidance, and had come to him to ask him what in the world should they do next or first or whatever, because they were just totally in the dark and completely lost in this great new path. The new Guru masters for ISKCON now sat at the feet of Srila Sridhar Maharaj, seeking his guidance on how they should take their first steps and become gurus. And due to a total lack of any guidance given by Srila Prabhupada, they now asked Sridhar Maharaj to please guide them and shed light of his knowledge on how they were to proceed and how all of this was to work. In looking back, you would also think that Sridhar Maharaj would have suspected that something was not really right here at all. You would have thought that he should have known that Srila Prabhupada wouldn't have left the GBC in the dark, total darkness, on such an all-important topic as this. But for whatever reason, Sridhar Maharaj didn't see the glaring, conspicuous by its absence fact that Srila Prabhupada hadn't given them those instructions. Rather, I can only assume that he must have felt honored and pleased that ISKCON's leaders, the GBC, and now these new acharyas, who he was told would become the next acharyas in the disciplic line, had come to him to seek his guidance and enlightenment on such an all-important topic. And so he must just not have taken the time to realize how odd it was that Prabhupada had not given them the guidance they needed. He must have also felt pleased that his old friend and godbrother, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, had recommended to the GBC that they seek his advice. He may have thought Srila Prabhupada wanted them to seek his advice on this very topic. However, that was not the case. But feeling thus honored, he eagerly gave his advice without questioning why Srila Prabhupada had left without him giving his own clear guidance on this issue. Srila Sridhar Maharaj would now become the teacher guide or the Shiksha Guru of ISKCON's new gurus. When the GBC approached Sridhar Maharaj for his help, they didn't show him or read to him the July 9th letter where Srila Prabhupada had actually only appointed these 11 men not as gurus, but as Rtvik representatives. They didn't read to him the transcript of the May 28th meeting where Srila Prabhupada discussed with the GBC this topic to get his opinion on whether or not Srila Prabhupada did actually appoint these 11 men to become actual gurus. Rather, the GBC, instead, they just informed Sridhar Maharaj that Prabhupada had appointed them, as a matter of fact. And I should note here that the GBC actually didn't have a transcript of that May 28th meeting at that time. The original tapes had been sent off to Krishna Kanti in Los Angeles, running the tape ministry. And that tape is not a lecture. The tape ministry only put out tapes that were lectures or philosophical discussions, morning walks, conversations in his room on philosophical topics, but not on, managerial meetings. Those weren't put into the tape ministry. So that tape just sat there and basically on the shelf for many years. So the GBC didn't even have a transcript of the May 28th meeting. What they had was their own GBC notes. And I'll explain this in the chronological timeline. Those notes that the GBC had were wrong, and they were misleading, obviously, because they were wrong. And that's what they based the idea that Prabhupada had appointed these men to be gurus. So they just informed Sridhar Maharaj that this was a matter of fact, that Prabhupada had appointed them. And Sridhar Maharaj assumed that what they were telling him was a fact. and was totally true. And therefore, he saw no reason actually to question the validity of what they told him. Thus, Sridhar Maharaj gave his advice and guidance based on the faulty information the GBC gave him. If what they told him was flawed and incorrect, then the advice he gave would also be just as flawed, even though it might have been good advice based on that information. If the information was wrong, then the advice would be wrong. But this wasn't known to him at the time, and therefore he just gave what he felt was the best advice for the situation that the GBC presented to him. In the chronological timeline section, I will show that what the GBC told Sridhar was totally flawed and incorrect, and thus the advice he gave was just as flawed and wrong. But at the time, Sridhar Maharaj didn't know this. If you give the best mathematician in the whole world, if you give him flawed and incorrect numbers to work with, while his calculations may be perfect, the results will be just as flawed as the incorrect numbers that he was supplied. So I don't blame Sridhar Maharaj for the flawed nature of any advice he may have given, since the flaws were not of his own doing. But there is another point here, which we must make at this time, which really shows how bitterly ironic it was for the GBC to have wound up seeking Srila Sridhar Maharaj's guidance and enlightenment on this particular issue of how to establish gurus after the disappearance of the current Acharya.